So, our program tonight, as Scott mentioned, is titled Air and Naval Power in the 21st Century. And there could not be a topic more on point for today's environment. The most recent edition of the National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy described the threats posed by the, quote, pacing challenge of China and the, quote, acute threat of a resurgent Russia. While the National Security Strategy integrates the traditional elements of national power, it's the military element that underpins everything. It helps deter our adversaries and lets us quickly respond if deterrence fails. However, the forces which can most quickly project visible power, our naval and air forces, in many aspects are the oldest and smallest they've been since World War II. And the trend and the risk is increasing. So how do we get that way? What are the implications, and what can we do about it? Our speakers today for this vitally important program are two of the leading national spokespersons and advocates for naval and air power. I want to introduce our speakers now, and I just ask you please hold your applause till I get through both introductions, and then we'll give them a warm Texas welcome. First, Admiral James Fogo, goes by Jamie, is currently serving as the Dean for the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States. He's a 1981 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, and his military career has spanned multiple levels, from command of attack submarine USS Oklahoma City to squadron, group, fleet, and unified combatant commands. His last assignment was Commander, U.S. Naval Forces Europe and Africa, and Allied Joint Forces Command at NATO. Throughout his career, Admiral Fogo has been a champion of viewing and utilizing the military as an extended arm for U.S. diplomacy. He's an Olmsted and Morrow Scholar, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Center for European Policy Analysis. Ms. Heather Penny is a senior resident fellow at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, where she conducts cutting-edge research on defense policy issues, lectures and writes on air power, force structure, and weapons development. In her military career, she served as an F-16 pilot with the District of Columbia Air National Guard, and she flew in combat in Iraq. She serves as a director of the Experimental Aircraft Association and is a passionate advocate for aviation, women in aviation, aviation history, and the future of aviation. So Jamie, Heather, we're honored to have you here. Let's give them a Texas welcome. Thank you. I'll now pass the mic to General Campbell for the rest of your program.
Okay, thanks, Barry. So for those of you who've been here before, you know how the Q&A piece works. We got several ways you can ask a question. One is if you have your phone out there and you're finished watching the game, you can email a question to that inbox, and I'll see that, and I'll add it to the question queue. There's some 3x5 cards on the table. If you want to write down a question, hold it up. We'll have a runner that'll come pick that up and bring it up to me. And finally, we'll get to live questions. Just hold up your hand. We'll get you a microphone. We are videotaping this, so we want to make sure you have a mic so we can get it on the tape. And if you ask a live question, please make it a question and not a speech. Usually we have a lot more questions than we have time for, so we may not get to all of them. As Scott said, we may extend the time a little bit past 7 o'clock. So Admiral Fogo, Ms. Penny, we're pleased to have you all here. And Admiral, I'll turn it over to you for your opening remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, what an honor it is to be here tonight. And I bring you greetings from the Navy League of the United States headquarters in Washington, D.C., where for the last year I have been the Dean of the Center for Maritime Strategy. It's a new startup think tank in Washington that deals with maritime domain issues. We are predominantly advocates for the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Marine Corps, our Merchant Marine, and our shipbuilding and industrial base in this country, all good things that we need to do. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about great power competition in terms of the pivot or the pirouette. And I'm a little disappointed to tell you that that is the question for the Joint Force today and for our defense leadership in DOD and for our Congress to determine whether or not we pivot to the Pacific, which has been labeled as the pacing threat for the past few years, or do we continue to pirouette to other crises throughout the world? In Europe, we are in a proxy war in Europe with the Russian Federation right now, and Iran is acting up again. The biggest problem is that we can't afford to fight a campaign in two theaters at once. We used to be able to do that. We haven't really husbanded our resources. Congress has been very generous. Congressman Self is here tonight, and we were talking about this at dinner. $817.5 billion. That's the largest defense budget ever. But we have, during the post-Cold War era, collected more enemies than I have ever seen. I did 40 years of active duty before they told me to go find out what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, and I left the service. I have never seen it like this. In my day, it was the Cold War and bipolarity. Today, it is multipolar, and those two men are public enemy number one, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. If you're wondering why there's bubbles coming up on the screen from the bottom, I'm a submariner. And so that is a U.S. Navy fast attack submarine with its hydrogen overboard. We split the water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. We make oxygen and drip it into the ship so we can breathe, and we get rid of the hydrogen overboard. And so those bubbles are coming from a boat. And you can't see it because we are the most stealthy force out there. So public enemy number one, and I talked about what it was like during the Cold War. I lived through that, and I have the clicker, so I guess I will advance the slide here. Counterintuitive to the next one. Nope. There we go. Okay. On the left-hand side of your screen, you see a submarine, USS Sea Devil, surfaced at the North Pole in June of 1985. That was smack dab in the middle of the Third Battle of the Atlantic. That was my war, the Third Battle. Many Vietnam warriors here tonight. You know, we went to sea in 1983 on Sea Devil, and we stayed at sea because we were in a proxy war in the undersea domain with the Russians. And we operated up in the high north, and we operated under the polar ice cap, and we came up at the polar ice cap to show the Russians that we were there in their backyard, in the bastion for defense of their ballistic missile submarines. And think about the movie Hunt for Red October. So we've got Top Gun 2 out. I think it's about time we had a Hunt for Red October 2, but I don't see that coming anytime soon. But that was 1985. And then all of a sudden, you know, in 1989, I was over in Europe. The Berlin Wall came down. I came back to the United States. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Vladimir Putin was a KGB agent in East Berlin at the time, and he never got over it, and he never forgave the West for the demise of the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union wasn't going to last. It was a paper tiger. Its structure was incompatible with any kind of functional system in the rest of the world. I mean, democracies have their warts, but communism just doesn't work hands down. But everybody thought, oh, we're going to have a peace dividend. This is the end of history, a famous guy named Francis Fukuyama. That never came about, but we fooled ourselves into thinking that this peace dividend meant that we don't need a strong armed force. Well, fortunately, we continue to build submarines in the U.S. inventory, and I got the chance to command one of the best submarines in the United States Navy, and that is the boat on the right, USS Oklahoma City, which, by the way, in 2001, 16 years after my first trip to the North Pole, was up there again. Now, the first thing I'll tell you is USS Oklahoma City, our motto, the sooner the better. I did a lot of time at the Brickyard in Oklahoma City, taking my sailors out to meet the kids in underprivileged communities and spending time during hurricane relief and tornado relief out there. And I also had the pleasure of eating several times with the mayor and city council at the Cattleman's Cafe. That's, folks, the steaks are great here in Texas, but they're really good at the Cattleman's Cafe. One of the other things I told Soup and Bob Brown I would do is wear my shit-kicking boots from Oklahoma City tonight. So I'm not a Texan, but I consider myself an honorary Oklahoman. I love these boots. And unfortunately, you don't wear cowboy boots when you're at the North Pole. That's my crew, 2001, Lance Sub Ice-X, 2001. What was the difference between 85 and 2001? One, we didn't come up under ice because there was no ice. There's more blue than there is white, and that was 2001. That's over 20 years ago. Two, when my guys went up topside and took a look around, we had our ice pilots, and we were trying to figure out how we could get close to an ice floe so we could go ashore, such as it was. We saw plastic and trash bags in the water. So that tells you two things. Climate change is real, and we've got to take better care of our environment. It's absolutely beautiful. You can see hundreds of feet down. You can see the aquatic life, the bearded seals, the whales, and the other life that's up there, and we've got to take care of it. You also see a lot of polar bears up there, and you've got to be careful, and Arctic foxes too. So that's a real problem. And the other thing was, in 2001, the Russians were back. And what do I mean by that? The Russians never stopped putting money and rubles into the undersea domain. On the left, you see the Russian submarine Severodvinsk. They've just come out with the second ship of the class. It's a very capable submarine. It is not yet quieter or more lethal than our Virginia-class submarines, but if we don't keep the investment up in our undersea domain, they will surpass us. They're close, but I think the economic sanctions are going to cripple them, and they're going to have to divert money to the war in Ukraine. But that is a very capable submarine that wages the fourth battle of the Atlantic today. And I've written extensively about that, and so have others. Submarine on the right scares me even worse than the submarine on the left. Submarine on the right is a new development submarine that is in the White Sea conducting sea trials called the Belgorod. It is a dual mission ship, kind of weird. It has a torpedo that is 65 feet long, the Poseidon torpedo. Putin himself leaked this weapon system to the Western press because he wanted us to know they were working on it. Supposedly, it is a nuclear-powered torpedo. Who makes a nuclear-powered torpedo? Supposedly, it is a dual-capable warhead, both conventional and nuke. And it is intended to traverse the Atlantic and hit who? The United States of America. Now, that's bad enough for that one submarine. It also has a deep-diving nuclear mini-sub. Now, what in the world would they use that for? Research and development? No, no. To threaten our undersea critical infrastructure. This is the undersea critical infrastructure of the world. It carries 95% of our market communications, your stocks and bonds and investments, and also military secure communications all over the world. If anybody messes with that, and if you've been watching the news, you saw what somebody did to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline up in the Baltic, yet to be determined what nation did it. But come on, isn't it obvious? Who would do that? Not a Baltic ally, not the Swedes, not the Scandinavians, not the Germans, not the Poles, most likely the Russians. So if they can threaten that, they can threaten our undersea critical communications. And that bothers me a lot because that would create a lot of havoc here in the United States. And you've seen what these cyber attacks have done recently, particularly on the Colonial Pipeline last year with gas and oil up and down the East Coast. Now, where have we been while all this stuff has been going on? I call it the boiling frog scenario. For those of you that don't know the analogy, ladies, when you throw that frog, you're going to have frog legs for dinner, you toss them into a pot, and you start turning that rheostat up, that frog is fat, dumb, and happy. He goes, you know, it's cold in the pond, now I'm warm. I'm feeling pretty good. I'm an amphibian. But after a while, the water comes to a boil, and that frog does too, and he doesn't even know it. Well, that's us as we watch this great power competition. So we've been a little bit asleep at the switch as Vladimir Putin has pulled ahead and pulled off this stunt in Ukraine that probably could have been prevented. I want to take you back to the early days of this. I want to take you back to 2007. It coincided with a speech Putin made in Munich. The Munich Security Conference is next week. That's where he appeared and threatened the West because he said we threatened him. And that is just absolutely not true. In 2007, I was the executive assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, and arguably one of the best chairmen that we ever had, but I'm prejudiced because I'm a naval officer and so was he. I loved Admiral Mullen, and he certainly did right by me or I wouldn't be standing in front of you today. Admiral Mullen and I made our first trip overseas to the NATO Council of, it's called the CMC, the Chairman of the Military Committee's Council, in 2007, shortly after he took office. And he said, hey, you know, Jamie, I'm going to shake it up a little bit here. We're going to have a dialogue with the Russians. While we're there, the NATO-Russia Council will meet. Russia's not a member of NATO, but they had a sitting chief of defense, that's Yuri Nikolaevich Baluyevsky, on the NATO-Russia Council. So the Admiral had a letter put together, and I made sure that it was all typed up and the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted. He signed it. It was an invitation to Baluyevsky to come to the United States for his first counterpart visit. So when we went into the chambers in Brussels at NATO headquarters, Baluyevsky was sitting at the end of the table, and so were all the NATO members at the time. Baluyevsky looked like Khrushchev, kind of a bowling ball of a man, bald, and it reminded me of the time when Khrushchev took his shoe off and beat it on the table in front of John F. Kennedy. He was railing on the United States, the encirclement of Mother Russia, how we were the bane of their existence, the root of all evil. And Admiral Mullen looked at me and he said, do you have that letter? I said, yes, sir, I do. After the meeting was over, and none of our allies came to our defense, except Admiral Mullen stood up to Baluyevsky. He said, I don't know if I want to give it to that son of a bitch. And I said, sir, I think you should, because there's no way that we're going to have a dialogue with him other than in this circus forum. So he walked over and handed Baluyevsky the letter. Big smile. Get to come to the United States, bring your wife, go shopping in New York. So Mullen said, we want to do this right. We want to have a relationship. We want an icebreaker. It's up to you, Captain Fogo, to figure it out. By the way, the intel guys tell me that he likes tinkering in old cars. He does this at his dacha outside Moscow with his son. So go figure out something that would be an interesting thing for him to do, and we'll surprise him. Well, I knew an Air Force colonel who was down the hall, and he had this absolutely beautiful 1973 Chevrolet Corvette that he had restored. It was in mint condition. And Colonel, I said, hey, can you help the chairman out here? We're going to surprise the Russian chief of defense, and we want to put your car on a static display outside the Pentagon and then walk him out to see it. He works on cars on the weekend back in Russia. And the colonel's like, the chairman is going to make me a general for this. You can absolutely have my car and the keys, Captain Fogo. I said, great. Bring your car in on Tuesday morning and park it on the river entrance to the Pentagon. So he did, and he flipped me the keys. I went into the original meeting that we started at 8 o'clock with Baluyevsky. We were in there for about 3 hours. It was a real bladder check for the guys. And finally, Mullen says, hey, let's take a break and go down to the chairman's conference room, and we'll have some tea and some cookies and things like that. But instead of doing that, he walked Baluyevsky out of his office, took a left turn. Now, the Russians had GRU, which are KGB handlers with General Baluyevsky, and they didn't know what was going on because everything was scripted. And then Mullen takes another left turn out to the river entrance of the Pentagon, and Baluyevsky walks down the steps with his Russian handlers behind him, and he sees this car. And he's like, oh! And so Mullen goes, Jamie, you got the keys? Yes, sir. I pull them out of my pocket and I flip them to him. Now that colonel who owned the car, he's standing about 10 feet away, and he's like, whoa, wait a minute, keys? So Baluyevsky and Mullen get in the car. And Mullen says, take her for a spin. Now the colonel's having a heart attack. He was a Warthog driver, A10, you can see hog driver on the license plate. And so Baluyevsky starts to try to put the car in gear. A Russian stick shift is 180 out from an American stick shift. Reverse is forward, forward's reverse. Mullen doesn't speak Russian. He's trying to tell him, no, this way, Yuri, this way. Meanwhile, the clutch is grinding, smoke's coming out of the car. The colonel's like, I was like, don't worry, you're going to be a general. And so they finally get it in gear, and they take off, and they shunt all the way around the parking lot. Of course, these KGB guys are like, what's going on? What are you doing with our chod? They come back after a lap. It's less than 1/8 of a mile in this parking lot. And I hear Mullen say, well, now you got the handle of it. Take her for a real spin. And Baluyevsky just puts it in gear, lays a patch, and goes out. This is how we got this picture. The Russian GRU guys are following him, running after him, thinking he's defecting in this car. It worked. It worked. That night at dinner, it was not General Baluyevsky and Admiral Mullen, Admiral Mullen's quarters, at the chairman's quarters. It was Mike and Yuri. And that's when Baluyevsky told him, hey, look, Putin is real serious about this encirclement thing. So if you guys don't stop it, he's going to pull out of the OSCE agreements on transparency and exercises. And they did shortly thereafter. And Putin made a speech in Munich shortly thereafter. And the rest was history, because what happened after that, we spent all this time getting to know Balieski. I think I'm hung up here. Can somebody do something with the computer system for me? We are stuck. Okay. There we go. So all this time with Balieski, and he was almost immediately replaced by General Makarov, who was from Siberia. He was a logistician. He was supposed to fix the Russian armed forces, make it more agile, more flexible. And if I asked you how he did, you'd probably give him an F, because they haven't proved that they're worth a salt in the field in Ukraine. But the first thing that Makarov did was invade Georgia. Very, very dangerous. Attacking bases. We had Americans there. We had Georgians in Iraq. We brought them back. They threatened to shoot down the airplanes. Very, very dangerous situation. Everybody knew it. And so the United States said, look, we got to do something about this. And we did. We had the infamous reset between Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Lavrov, who was their Minister of Foreign Affairs and still there. I think he's lasted 5 or 6 U.S. Secretaries of State. People used to like Lavrov. They said he was quite a diplomat back in the day of Henry Kissinger, but he has completely gone to the far side of the Russian Communist Party and Putin's cronies and his oligarchs. So we signed this reset, and then things got better for a little while. This is this boiling frog, right? Oh, it's going to be great. Don't worry about the Russians. You know, they're back in the fold. So during the Sochi Olympics, I was a 1-star in Naples, Italy, as 6th Fleet Deputy and Submarine Group 8. I was a 3-star 6th Fleet Commander after that. And then I was Naval Forces Europe, Naval Forces Africa, and JFC Naples for NATO. During the time of the Olympics in 2014, the command ship for the 6th Fleet was in the Black Sea, and we had a hotline with the Black Sea Russian Fleet Commander in the event that there was a terrorist incident in Sochi, because we had lots of Americans and lots of senior people over there at the Olympics in Sochi. And so we thought, wow, we've arrived. We have communications with the Russians, a hotline, local fleet headquarters talking to one another. Didn't last long, because Putin was so incensed at the color revolution in Maidan that he directed his chief of defense, the new one, Gerasimov, to invade Crimea, which they did without firing a shot. Little green men, and we were completely ignorant. This is, again, the boiling frog is boiling. My job after that as the 6th Fleet Commander was to rebuild the Ukrainian fleet. And so that's me in Odessa, next to their flagship, Hemet Sagadashny, with the American ambassador, Jeff Pyatt, on my right, and the Ukrainian Prime Minister, Yatsenyak, on my left. And the Russians hate that man. Unfortunately, we didn't get very far before this war broke out, and Hemet Sagadashny, their one capital ship, which they revered as their flagship, was ordered sunk in the port of Mykolaiv by President Zelensky because he was afraid it was going to fall into Russian hands. Can you imagine? I know how I would feel as a commanding officer if I had to put shaped charges on the side of my ship and blow a hole in it and sink it in port. Just unbelievable. The other thing that we tried to do during this interim period was to rebuild the Navy with excess defense articles. So we gave the Ukrainians 4 Island-class Coast Guard cutters. They picked the best ones out of the fleet that was in layup in Baltimore, Maryland. Their chief of naval operations came over, Admiral Vornchenko, and walked the pier, said, I want that one, that one, that one, that one. We shipped them over there. But when we shipped these Island-class Coast Guard cutters, they used to have a deck gun on the forward deck. We cut off the gun and put on a blank plate and said, you want a gun, get it yourself. Again, the time to rearm Ukraine was in 2014, when nobody would have blamed us when they illegally annexed Crimea. Next, we watched as the Russians took more and more. They strangled the Sea of Azov. They took it over. They strangled the city of Mariupol before destroying it in the war. And then they started on the Black Sea. They put all these notice to mariners out, typically used to recognize an exercise where you're going to drop ordnance, shoot a torpedo, fire a missile, or lay mines. They last for a couple of weeks and they go away. You want to keep the fishermen out. You want to keep commercial traffic out so nobody gets in a hazardous situation. They left these up for a year before the invasion of Ukraine on 24 February. We should have seen it coming. And as the invasion started, they took over a lot of territory. 4 different armies on 4 different axes going in. But the Ukrainians fought back, and that's about the extent of where they are today. They pushed them out over a third or 2/3 of the territory that they originally took. The Ukrainians are great fighters. This commemorative stamp about Snake Island that you've heard about says it all. The United States has tried to help. Thank you to Congressman Self for the appropriations that have gone on through Congress and through the Department of Defense and through the presidential drawdown. Transcom, General Van Ovost, who's a friend of mine, published this list of stuff that we sent Ukraine in May. It's almost doubled now. About 18 or 21 billion dollars worth of aid. And you saw the tanks are heading over there. Next thing will be F-16s, and Heather's an expert on F-16. She can tell you about that. But a little, too late. Now, Russia's not the only offender, and they're not the only enemy we have. Let's talk briefly here about China. When I talk to my friends in Europe about China, and NATO just published a paper and said, China is a challenge. I say a challenge. They are at least, the very least, an adversary, if not an enemy of our way of life, of democracy as you and I see it. But it's tough to convince the Europeans of that. And so my picture from the Panda Cam in Washington, D.C. of that Chinese panda eating a big fat tomato versus the dragon, I try to convince my friends, watch out for the dragon. They're not all pandas. My experience with them goes back to 2013. While I was working in the Pentagon after my first tour in Naples during the attack on Libya, I was in a one-star job, and I was on a speed dial with our Chief of Navy, Admiral Greenert, predecessor to Admiral Richardson, who you'll hear from in April. Admiral Greenert called me down to the office. Oftentimes we had a one-on-one, and it was a one-way conversation, something he didn't like about operations, something he didn't like about strategy. That day he called me in, he had a cup of coffee, he had a smile on his face. I thought, this is unusual, what's going to happen? He said, I just got a call from Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, former ambassador to the UN. President Obama, President Xi had a very interesting summit at Sunnylands, first time Obama ever met Xi in 2013 in California. They agreed to do 4 things. Talk about the theft of intellectual property, Chinese stealing our stuff, the imbalance in trade, nuclear non-proliferation, and rules of behavior in the maritime domain between our 2 navies. Rice told me, Admiral Greenert, CNO, we got the first 3, you got the last one. You're in charge of rules of behavior in the maritime domain. Do whatever you need to do to make this work. Get an agreement with the Chinese and get them to adhere to the rules. So Admiral Greenert said to me, Fogo, I don't have time for this. You're going to do it. And I said, sir, I'm a Cold Warrior. I spent all my time in the Atlantic with the Russians. I don't speak Mandarin. I've never served in the Pacific. He said, don't let the door hit you on the ass on the way out. Never tell the Chief of Naval Operations you're not going to do something when he gives you an order. So I learned. And I went off and I studied hard, and I looked at the problem. And the problem is the Chinese build walls. We Americans build bridges. That piece of land, or that thing that's dotted on there, is called the 9-dash line in the South China Sea. It includes a lot of water and some islands and rocks and shoals that the Chinese say are rightfully theirs, in violation of the UN Council on Law of the Sea. So all of these islands, like the Spratlys and the Parcel Islands, they claim they're really not theirs. This is the largest, Texas the largest state in the Union? I think so. The Sansha Prefecture, largest state or largest prefecture in China, but the least amount of land. So only as much land as the state of Delaware, spread out all over that water. But they claim it. They say it's theirs. So this is going to be a pretty tough negotiation. So I went to Beijing, and I sat down with Chinese interlocutors. That's me in front of the PLA, People's Liberation Army Navy headquarters, quite opulent, by the way, in the heart of Beijing. I'm circled in the middle, and over to your left is Rear Admiral Li Ji. He was a veteran of the Chinese PLA Navy, probably 30, 40 years. They warned me about him. They said, watch out for the Stockholm Syndrome. He's charming and disarming, taught himself English by himself, speaks like an Oxford professor. And when I got to sit down with him, I realized he was dangerous. But I bleed red, white, and blue just like you do, and I consider this a pretty interesting game of chess. So at the end of the day, probably sitting at these tables for hours and hours and days and weeks on end, we didn't get anywhere. The Chinese were arguing about, is it rules of behavior or the Americans like standards? We like standards because standards are a little bit loosey-goosey. If it comes within 50 yards of another ship, did you violate a rule? We don't want to listen to that every time we have a close encounter. We want standards, standards of good practice at sea. We don't want rules. You went 1 yard inside 500 yards, therefore you violated a rule, and you're going to have to pay a penalty for that. So at the end of the day, he said, they called me Fogo Shangzhang, and he was called the chief by, that means General Fogo. They don't have the rank of admiral in Mandarin. And he was the chief barbarian handler. When I asked one of his lieutenants, why do they call Admiral Li Ji the chief barbarian handler? Who is the barbarian? And they said, you are, Fogo Shangzhang. So we had breakfast with permission of the Office of Secretary of Defense. And he said, Fogo, do you know why we're here? And I said, yeah, to negotiate standards of behavior in the maritime domain. No, it's not why we're here. We're here because if President Xi and President Obama decide to go to war, it's their decision, not the decision for men on the bridge of a ship or women or men in the cockpit of an aircraft. They are gender neutral. They don't have women in their air arm or in their ships, which is why he used only the male reference there. Obviously, Heather flies the F-16. And I said, I couldn't agree with you more, Admiral Lee. And so from then on, we agreed to give in and go with rules. And we got an agreement. The agreement looked like this. Susan Rice was so happy she took it out of the Navy's hands. It had Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel sign it with Wang Yi, his Chinese counterpart. And it was done at the ASEAN Summit in 2015. And the two guys standing behind those Secretaries of Defense, Obama and Xi. So it was a pretty big deal, and I went back to the Pentagon, and Admiral Greenert said, here's your orders to Sixth Fleet. Now, at that time, I didn't let the door hit me on the butt on the way out, because I'd been in the Pentagon for 12 years of my life, and I was ready to go back to the operating forces. And when I did, I said, you know, we did something good. We can work with the Chinese. We can coexist. Until I got to Sixth Fleet, and I started watching the numbers. At the time of signing the agreement, they had 255 ships. Today, they have 360. We have 297. By 2030, they'll have 425. To do what? What's the threat? We're not going to invade them. Again, we build bridges, they build walls. Out on those islands, rocks, and shoals, this is the Subi Reef, time-lapse photography, 2012 to 2018. It was a reef in 2012. Today, it is a stationary aircraft carrier defended by integrated air and missile defense to give them further reach into the South China Sea to defend against us or to attack us. And this reef is contested by Taiwan, Korea, Philippines, and Vietnam, but the Chinese didn't care. They just took it and built on it. So we're seeing the same boiling frog taking place in the South China Sea. My friend Chaz Richard, four-star admiral, submariner like me, just retired from STRATCOM. On his way out the door, he said, America is a sinking ship. We're sinking slowly, but we're not keeping up with the pacing threat of the Chinese or the Russians. He pointed out that the Chinese currently have 350 nuclear warheads. Between Russia and the United States in New START, 1550 and 1550 for 3,100 warheads. The Chinese are in a nuclear breakout right now, and by 2030, they will have 3,350 nuclear warheads, and they are not in one arms control scheme whatsoever. That is very dangerous. They have the DF-17 hypersonic missile. We're just trying to develop one. We recently tested one just a few weeks ago. I think the Air Force did that. I watched them build the Doralé base in the Horn of Africa, where we've had a base for over 20 years called Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. The Chinese came in 3 years, poured millions of tons of concrete, didn't use one foreign national from Djibouti. They brought in all third country national labor. They didn't put 1 cent into the economy. We support about 12 to 14% of the Djiboutian economy with 1,000 day workers at our base every day and all the other payments that we make and taxes that we make to Djibouti. But they're there and they are ready to receive one of their new Chinese aircraft carriers. And so they have completed the One Belt, One Road China dream that she talked about a few years ago. So I ask you, is it a pivot or a pirouette? And we'll talk about that tonight, and we'll have Heather give us a breakdown of some of the budget process and how that's either helped or hindered the Air Force. And the last thing I'll say is it takes a little bit to run a center like mine. Should you be feeling philanthropic, or if you want to get on our website, or if you know somebody in the defense industry that would like to help us, it costs about $1 million to run a center like that every year, and I could use some help and I could use some more manpower. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop here and turn it over to Heather.
Thank you, sir. That was an excellent overview of the strategic challenge and the history of how we got to where we're at. So what I'll be talking about today is really kind of a history of the budget, at least from an Air Force perspective. As you've all heard the saying, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. The same is true for air power. And I'm sure that if you spoke with Admiral Fogo later, he would give you a similar story regarding the Navy budget. This is what we talk about today, but really what I'm interested in is the discussion. So from an Air Force perspective, a lot of people think, hey, you know, the Air Force, you got these big, expensive, gold-plated aircraft, you get this really big budget, and that's a belief. So for example, a lot of people believe that in the 2023 budget, the Air Force came out as a winner, right? Fantastic. So what's the problem? Why are you guys so concerned? Well, the challenge is that budget is not actually all Air Force TOA, top line authority, right? Total obligation authority. Not all that money belongs to the Air Force. As a matter of fact, $40 billion of that passes directly through the Air Force budget to other government agencies. That's right, we're laundering money for the government. But this is a big problem because people don't realize that that's exactly what is going on. Now, this all started in 1961. Way back at the beginning of the Cold War, before we had the kind of transparency that we do today in budget documentation. And it was meant to obscure what we were spending our money on from the Soviets. We didn't want them to know that we were doing things like inventing satellites and agencies that could see into other nations through those satellites. And at the time, the Air Force budget was significant because of the national strategy we had at the time. So it really didn't impact the Air Force's ability to do its job. That is not true today. $40 billion, actually, and out of that is about a little over $20 billion of procurement. That's nearly half of the Air Force's procurement budget. So it's made a significant impact on what the Air Force is able to do. So this is the reality. You thought that we were at 234? No. For the Air Force itself, that blue budget is really only about $170 billion. Now, when you look at that, you go, okay, well, hey, what about the Space Force? We just stood up the Space Force, right? So we've broken that out too. That's $24.5 billion, which is significantly less, by the way, than that pass-through money that I was talking about. When you break all of this out, including you take the Marine Corps budget out of the Navy budget, you see that the Air Force comes in last. And, oh, by the way, those pass-through monies over the last 30 years have totaled over $1 trillion. This is a significant cost opportunity for what I would argue is one of the most essential forces of our armed services. We really, my bumper sticker is if you don't have an Air Force, you cannot have a joint force because of all the things that we do, not only to provide independent effects, but to support the other services. This is a 30-year trend line. So what I just showed you was a snapshot of 2023. This is a 30-year trend line of what that Air Force blue budget has been. And we actually include the Space Force budget because we only recently broke that out as a separate service. So you can see this purple line, that's what we've added the pass-through to. That pass-through funding, when we add it in, for the last 10 years has exceeded, for the most part, Air Force blue budget. That's a lot for the fourth estate. for competing and being more than a combat arm of the Department of Defense. And that's had a significant impact. Now, if you look at this, you go, hey, the Army's had a lot more in the course of over the course of the last 20 years. Well, of course, because we were in Iraq and Afghanistan. So those investments made sense. It made sense at the time, given the wars that we were in, to resource the Army appropriately to do the things that they needed to do. And the Navy and the Air Force sacrificed to be able to support that. But it's had a significant and lasting consequence on our force structure and our ability to respond to the challenges that Admiral Fogo spoke about. If we take a look historically at how the Air Force has been funded and what our force structure has done, because Admiral Fogo said, hey, we're the smallest, the oldest, and the least ready we've ever been, and that is true. If you look at the history of our funding and what our force structure is, you can see there's some really interesting stories going on here. This blue line, as you read it, is our budget, so that's the blue budget. And then you've got total aircraft inventory, and I'm really focusing on aircraft here because that is really the Air Force's primary means of creating effects where we need them to be. That's how we get weapons onto targets, is we deliver them primarily through aircraft. So that's what I'm focusing on here. So the yellow line is that total inventory. So what's happening? We see in the decades of the 1980s, the Reagan-era defense transformation. We get a lot of funding right there, but we kind of stay stable. This is the Carter drawdown post-Vietnam. You can see the build-up here of the Century series and really kind of building up the Air Force to begin with. So in the 80s, we get a lot of money, but we're not really doing a whole lot to buy more aircraft. Not true. What the Reagan-era defense spending did was replace those older aircraft with new ones. So it's a total fleet turnover. We're moving away from the Century series fighters, the F-100s and the F-101s, and we're moving into the aircraft that I flew. Fourth generation. So we're going from third generation to fourth generation aircraft. We're really turning over and transforming the Air Force through the Reagan-era defense spending. But then what happens? In the 1991, we see the fall of the Soviet Union, and the nation cuts the Air Force in half. The nation is tired of defense budgets. They're tired of all that spending. They want to reap the peace dividend. So DoD goes on not just a procurement holiday, but they slash the Air Force by half. So that's really kind of what you're seeing here is not just a drop in budgets, but a serious cut in total aircraft inventory. Well, we've been fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan for about 20 years, right, from 2001 to 2021. So what was going on there? We cut our Air Force in half, but then the demand signal for the Air Force skyrocketed to support those operations, which, by the way, the Air Force never left the Middle East. Following Desert Storm, we stayed there for Operation Northern Watch and Southern Watch. So as we drew down our forces, what happened to the remaining forces? Their ops tempo went up. So we aged those aircraft prematurely because we flew them harder and longer than we had ever planned for. And oh, by the way, we said, nah, don't worry about it. We're not going to really recapitalize you or replace you. You're good enough. We'll do a service life extension, and that'll be fine. 2001, we began flying even harder, even more. So despite increased budgets, all this is operations and maintenance. This is the cost of flying over in Iraq, Afghanistan. That's the cost of doing incremental modernization to aircraft that are 30 years old. Just to give you perspective, in 2001, when I launched on 9/11, my F-16 was built in 1985. I launched in 2001 in that jet, and you know what? She's still flying at Carswell. She's still flying at Carswell. Is that the kind of aircraft we want to send our young men and women over to fight China or Russia? And that's just a fighter. The bulk of our bomber fleet is from the Eisenhower era. So again, this is just an indication. These are fighter deliveries, just because that was something to break out. So you can see how little we have bought despite that total. And that's, again, just fighters. And I have this on here because Secretary Bob Gates really chastised the Air Force for being forward-looking, for being very concerned about the age of their fleet, about the need to be able to recapitalize, the need to be able to move into what we call fifth-generation aircraft, so stealthy fighters and bombers. He said, you guys have next war-itis. I'm concerned that that perspective has left our services bankrupt, and specifically for the Air Force and the Navy. And the reason why I say the Air Force and Navy together is because, yes, we do have very technical, very difficult weapon systems platforms. It takes time to build them. So let me introduce you to a concept I call strategic surprise. There's a time horizon that it takes to be able to build an aircraft, takes to be able to build a ship, and takes to be able to build a combat warrior, whether or not that's a fighter pilot, a bomber pilot, or a submariner, right? Now in the Air Force, I'm just going to take fighters because that's what I know. It's roughly about 5 years is your time horizon. It takes 5 years to build a fighter. 2 of those just to plan the budget cycle for it, right? Year one of the actual build is all your long lead items. Those are your raw materials, your bulkheads, and building things like your transistors and starting your sensors development. Year 2 is when you build all your sub-assemblies. So that's your fuselage, that's the nose section, that's empennage, those are the wings. And year 3 is your final assembly where you knit all those guys together like Legos. And you do all the testing on it, you make sure that it's good to go, and it rolls out the factory door and flies off to its operation. That's 5 years. It takes about 5 years to build a fighter pilot too, by the way, from zero to hero. Now, about a year in pilot training, and I know that we give wings out nowadays about 6 months into that, so you finish your basic primary training, you get your wings, and you, move forward, but it's still a year's worth of training before you go to your major weapon system. And your major weapon system, whether or not you're a fighter pilot, a bomber pilot, a tanker pilot, you're doing airlift, you're going to be there for another 6 to 9 months. So that's about 2 years for all of that training. You get to your operational unit, and before you become a 2-ship flight lead or a 4-ship flight lead and a mission commander, an instructor pilot, or an aircraft commander is going to be another 2 to 3 years. So you put all of those things together, it's roughly 5 years to build a credible combat pilot. Let me tell you why that matters. Experience matters in combat because if you don't have experience, that's when you begin to lose your force. You're nothing but a target. When you look back at the the European theater in World War II, or the Pacific theater in World War II, the reason why we were able to establish air superiority over the European theater isn't because they couldn't build fighters anymore, and it's not because they weren't training pilots anymore. It's because they had sent their best and their brightest and all of their instructor pilots to the front lines and never took them back. And when you get into a major conflict like this, ladies and gentlemen, it's a matter of statistics. Doesn't matter how good you are, it's statistics. And so the Germans, the Luftwaffe, lost their experienced pilots by 1943. Very similar to what the Japanese approach was towards their naval and air power. So they lost all of their experienced pilots. And what happens after that? They send these young guys up, and they are grapes. And we shoot them down, and we establish air superiority. That's why combat experience matters. So when the Air Force talks about their loss, the loss of pilots, they can't keep pilots, they've got this pilot's retention problem, they're losing this experience, that's why that matters. Because when you don't have experienced pilots, that's when your attrition goes up. That's when you lose boys and girls, that's when you got to send out the CSAR, that's when bad things start to happen, and it becomes a snowball that you can't recover from. This is just an example of where we are today, right? So in 1989, right before Desert Storm, this is fighters, this is bombers, the light blue, this is the stealthy stuff. Yeah, by the way, we're supposed to have at least 120 B-2s. We stopped those at 20. The B-2 can carry more payload It's the best and biggest bomber we have, and it's stealthy. But we only have 19 of them. 19 of them today. You think about what we spent to invent that platform, why would we not have really harvested what we had sowed? We never gained back the investment. So today, in 2022, these numbers, so this is what you've got for the total inventory again. This is your light blue, so that's F-22, F-35 for stealthy. The light blue down here is your B-2. And then after subtracting your training and tests, so forth, and then that's how much it goes down. And then you go mission capable rates. How can we sustain them? Who's ready to actually go? How do we fill combat lines? That's what we're down to. So for our bomber fleet, after applying all of those filters, this is what we're down to for your go-to-war force, 59 aircraft. For your fighter force, less than 1,000. Pirouette, we can't even pivot. But it's crucial because, as important as the Navy is, and when I think about the Navy, we have to go into the Pacific in a totally integrated fashion. But air power gets there at the speed of 600 knots, and everyone else gets there a little bit later. So if we need the option to be able to respond today or tomorrow, guess who's answering the call? The Air Force. Again, this is just a slide to show you at the ages that we are facing today. So while recapitalization for the Air Force has been on pause for 3 decades, and this is why we are now in a crisis. Because we didn't complete the B-2 buy, because we didn't complete the F-22 buy, because we are now slow-rolling F-35, all of these aircraft, we are at a cliff where we have to recapitalize virtually every single weapon system that the Air Force has right now. And I've been talking about airplanes, but the same is true for every other system within the Air Force, including weapons, including munitions, whether or not that's missiles or bombs. And the challenge that we face right now is buying more of the same old weapons isn't going to be good enough. We need to have survivable weapons. People don't think, they think about airplanes getting shot down, they don't realize bombs can be targeted. They don't realize missiles can be targeted. It's not just through electronic warfare. But if they really want to be able to protect that target, they're not going after just the aircraft. They're also going to go after the weapon as well. And as we learned in Ukraine, those tables, those weapons summary tables of how many weapons, how many bullets, how many bombs we use from World War II, those are actually still very accurate. So you can't gin up all of those weapons manufacturers, like it's not a water faucet that you turn on and it's not a spigot you turn on. It's a lot like the challenge with aircraft. It takes time to budget, takes time to build. And oh, by the way, do we have the industrial base to be able to do that? That's another concern. For another day, we'll talk about that later. But this is an indication of, okay, well, with the current inventory that we have, well, not current, but the plans through 2025, that would be the inventory of the precision-guided munitions that we have. At the rates that we would expect to expend them, it would last about 8.5 days. And again, this is just a summary slide. This is a result of 30 years of having deferred all of that recapitalization. Again, I mean, very generous budgets from Congress, but why have we gotten into the position where we're at? Because we have deferred that recapitalization for so long. Because we were focused on Iraq and Afghanistan. So you remember the slide where we showed how the Army budget had grown significantly more than the Air Force or the Navy budget? But that caused the Air Force and the Navy to defer that recapitalization, and it's causing a pileup of mission demands and force structure demands that, frankly, it's going to take significant investment to build out of. So what we recommend is frankly that the DoD should develop different pacing priorities for each service and then allocate resources accordingly. We can't afford to peanut butter spread stuff. And because of that pirouette that Admiral Fogo spoke about, what we should do is take a look at, in each one of those theaters, who is really going to be the lead service? What is the service, what are the capabilities that we really need to depend upon? And then how do we resource appropriately? In the European theater, yes, the Army is going to have a significant role, a significant play in that. And oh, by the way, when you take a look at the European theater, it's not just land. Remember, air and space covers 100% of the Earth, and they will require significant air power and space power to be able to execute that. But the Navy also has a crucial role in the Baltics and as well as the Arctic. That is something that people forget about when they think about in the North Sea. They forget about the Navy's role when they think about the European theater. But in the Pacific, absolutely, the Air Force and the Navy are going to have the lead role there. So DoD should take a look at that and then resource accordingly. This is just a number slide. We're just counting missiles and boats and airplanes, but it gives you an idea of how outmatched we are. And oh, by the way, people talk about A2AD, anti-access, area denial. The Chinese strategy isn't simply just shoot stuff down. China has watched and studied how we've gone to war since 1991. They know we fight as a system. And they also know that one of the ways that we've achieved efficiencies and effectiveness in our combat operations through our combined arms is because we operate and we fight as a system. So their strategy is to target the data links, the communication, the command and control, and the high-value assets that will collapse our operational structures. What does that mean? I'm going to blow up your AOC. I'm going to blow up your command and control centers. I'm going to jam your data links so you can't see anything. So the ways that we have developed to operate as a team, like a sports team, right? If they can take away the ball, if they can crush the quarterback, then we really lose all of our effectiveness. That is China's strategy against us. And so the way that we combat that is that we have to introduce more complexity and, frankly, capacity. So numbers do matter in this game, and not simply because you can't be in more than one place at one time. I mean, that is a physical truth. And when you're looking at the Pacific, that's part of the tyranny of distance. You can't be smaller but better here. You just have to have a lot. And you have to be better. So the challenge we're facing is not something that we have seen for a very, very long time. And when we begin to talk about offset strategies, I caution you, because the offset strategies were designed to invest in technologies that would allow us as a smaller force to continue to prevail. And that was a valid need at the time. But through the 1990s, the aughts, and the teens, offset then became a shorthand for, well, I can cut force and just invest in R&D, and I'll get better later, and so I can be smaller but better. We have passed that point of return. We can no longer be smaller but more effective, or smaller but better. We have got to invest in capacity as well. So this is just, I mean, hey, disconnect between ends, ways, and means. We can't get there from here. It is going to take investment in the things that matter. And that investment is not simply about inventing new things. You may have heard a lot of media surrounding how proud the Department of Defense was in their R&D budget, which is great. We have to be able to invest in those technologies that will allow us to be more effective. But one of the challenges that we have with R&D is what we call, inside the building, the valley of death. So much R&D gets spent and never turns into a program of record that warfighters see on the back end. So we must be focused on the research and development that we do invest in and make sure that those become actual weapon systems and things that warfighters can use to go do their jobs. Now that's part of what Secretary Kendall is trying to do within the Air Force. Took a look at he came in a couple years ago, took a look at the entire Air Force portfolio and said, we need to really focus what we're doing with our research and development. And through his operational analysis arm, took a look at that, crunched a bunch of numbers, did a bunch of wargaming, and said, I'm going to focus on 7 things. And these are his 7 operational imperatives. And I fully agree with him that this is an important thing to be able to do. This is his focusing mechanism for how he is going to look at the technologies that he needs based off of China as a pacing threat. And he has paired the operational user with the technologists and the acquisition folks because he is dedicated to making sure that these OIs become real widgets people can use. And that's a good thing. And I hope that this has enough power to outlast when Secretary Kendall leaves, because that's the other danger of the Pentagon. If it's personality-based, it'll just outweight you, and things can falter and change within the next administration, next leadership. But I think he's right-minded in where he's going. Here's the challenge that I see with what's happening, is that depending on who you talk to fulfill these OIs is between $13 and $17 billion. That's quite a bit. It's quite a bit. Now, we can probably get there if we begin to reallocate and create some more transparency. Remember when I talked about pass-through funding and creating more transparency about what's going on there? But the challenge is that what he's doing right now is he's divesting to invest. And I can see his logic, right? He's got all these old airplanes. They don't really fly very much. They're not really relevant to the future flight. Let me get rid of them, and that'll free up some cash that I can put in my OIs and build the Air Force I need. Sounds pretty rational. Here's 2 major problems I have with that. Divesting to invest means that you gap your force. You are inducing significant risk by getting rid of airplanes, getting rid of weapon systems, and basically leaving that mission area uncovered. For R&D, that you are not entirely sure when you're going to be able to field that. I mean, the last time we invented a new airplane, let's just take the F-22, for example, that was roughly, from the time we wrote the requirements in 1986 to the time that we actually went initial operational capability in 2005, 19 years. 15 years for F-35. So it takes us a long time to do these things. So when we talk about gapping a mission area to focus that money in R&D, we don't necessarily know when that's going to get fielded, and importantly, fielded in a useful quantity. So I have significant concerns about gapping that right now. Here's the other concern I have with divesting to invest and gapping the force, is that in the Air Force, and I would argue this is probably very similar to the Navy, is that when you get rid of an airplane, you get rid of the people. So AWACS, if we divest AWACS, our air battle managers, JSTARS, our air battle managers, because we're going to go to this new thing called Advanced Battle Management System, which they're still working on. They're doing a lot of good work out at Nellis, trying to invent what this looks like, invent those technologies, but they're getting rid of those airplanes today. What happens to the air battle managers? They go away. So all of the knowledge that we have, all of that intellectual capacity, all of the experience, that vaporizes because we lose those air battle managers when we gap that mission area, and we'll have to reinvent the wheel. We can't afford to do that. We need their expertise, we need their experience. So when we gap those mission areas, not only are we losing those platforms, we're losing that expertise, that experience, we are creating risk because we are showing areas to the Chinese and to the Russians that we cannot cover. So what are our recommendations? And I would argue this is probably fairly similar. Obviously, the Navy is going to have different priorities, but this is probably fairly similar. Our recommendations moving forward. We know that we have to transform, but we believe that we must be able to do that in a way that mitigates risk as we continue to reach towards the future. And again, no bugs, no Buck Rogers. We think the first thing that we need to do is create better transparency, oversight, and balance among the services. And that first comes by removing pass-through and then creating an appropriate force planning construct that looks at the pivot or that pirouette appropriately. I mean, for example, think about it. When we evacuated Kabul, that was a hot mess, wasn't that? The AMC, those airlifters, they were awesome. You know who nobody talks about? The CRAF, the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. Anyone realize that in order to be able to execute the Kabul evacuation, we had to activate the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, airline pilots and airliners. If we don't have the depth of force to get out of Kabul, who thinks we can do the Pacific? It's not all about fighters. It's the whole force. So we need to have that force planning construct that differentiates between the pacing scenarios. So we can take a look at the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Space Force, and say, okay, in this scenario, this is what we need you to do. In this scenario, this is what we need you to do. And then allocate those resources appropriately. And that's going to require, for real, all-domain warfighting concepts. We should not stop fighting as a system. That's part of what makes us so awesome. But we need to make sure that we're looking appropriately at where we have the redundancies and where we don't need those redundancies. And then, as I mentioned, resources, services appropriately. And I believe a critical component of that, and I'm sure Admiral Fogo would argue this for the Navy as well, is by making the Department of the Air Force and the Department of the Navy whole for the deferred recapitalization that we have done for the past 30 years. And you can see that we've got some specific recommendations there. And I'll just close with, you know, the only thing more expensive than a first-rate Air Force is a second-rate Air Force. That's a quote by Admiral Kenny, who is in the Pacific. And the reason why he said that is if you have a second-rate Air Force, you lose. Yep. Thank you.
There we go. Thanks for the great remarks. That's perfect intro to what we want to talk about tonight. And I'm going to start off with by the way, we're not going to be done by 7 o'clock. I'm going to start out with a question for each of you just as get the conversation going, and then I've already got a couple of good questions on email. Siri is talking to me in my hearing assistance here, so I'm getting help from another woman. So to kick this off, and I'll throw this one out to Admiral Fogo, I'll get you a mic here in just a second. You know, this is a question that comes up occasionally when you're talking to taxpayers, the raw taxpayers, at a FY23 budget of top line of $817 billion or so. That's greater than the sum of the next 12 nations, their defense budgets. So how do we think about that? What's the reason that we are apparently under-resourced in our services with a budget of that size? How do we think about that as taxpayers? Give me that mic, would you?
Well, sir, I'm happy to jump into this, and please add in from your experience and your wisdom. But I would argue that the case that I just presented to you regarding the deferred recapitalization is the very reason why we need to have significant funding within the Department of Defense. Admiral Fogo laid out the case regarding how dangerous in an unprecedented manner and how unpredictable and the demands on our national defense security apparatus is today with China and Russia. And when you take a look at the services and what is expected of us to be able to operate within those scenarios, we cannot do it with the way that we have deferred that recapitalization. So the Air Force, for example, is having to look at recapitalizing its entire fighter fleet, field a brand new stealth bomber, recapitalize its intercontinental ballistic missile, its nuclear command control communications enterprise, so like 2 legs of the nuclear triad, in addition to standing up the Space Force and putting in new tankers, a new battle management system. That's a significant investment. It is a recapitalization crisis that is necessary for us to face, to have to be able to solve. And honestly, money is going to be what fixes that. Sir?
Yeah, one of the problems is the atrophy of the industrial base, which drives costs up in this country. So after World War II, we had, 40 some odd shipyards building ships around the country to add capacity to that naval program of 1938. Thank God we did it. We would have it would have taken us a lot longer to win the war in the Pacific. And when we thought there was, again, yet another peace dividend, we allowed that industrial capacity to atrophy. Today we have 9 yards. We can build a maximum of about 9 ships at a time in this country. We will not outsource because we want to buy American, and I understand that, so we've got to be smart about this. For instance, the new frigate program for the Navy is an Italian design. We were smart enough to buy that design because it's exceptional. Bring it to this country, set up a proxy board, and build out Marinette, Wisconsin to produce that Constellation-class frigate. The first one will be in 2026. But that is insufficient. We need cruisers, we need destroyers, we need aircraft carriers. The USS Ford fell behind because it had 23 new types of technology on that ship. We didn't prototype any of them. So the electromagnetic assisted launch, something President Trump didn't like, is a very effective program for throwing an aircraft at high speed enough to actually fly and get lift under the wings when it leaves the bow of that carrier without using steam or hydraulics. That's significant. And the Chinese want it, but they don't have it, so they're going to try to steal it. We've got it, and that's the first carrier, but that ship cost us about $15.5 billion. The new ballistic missile submarine, the Columbia class, the first ship of the line, $16 billion. The second, about $9 billion, then down to an economy of scale of $7 billion. The reason that we have to pay so much is because we don't have competition within our industrial base. We've allowed America to outsource everything. We've realized it was a mistake to outsource chip technology, hence the CHIPS Act, to try to bring it back here. If Taiwan goes away, that's our major chip producing factory or factories, and we're going to be in a world of hurt. That goes for more than just aircraft and ships, that goes for your cars, your computers, and everything else that you use with chip technology. Rare earth metals, the Chinese and the Russians have a lock on those. Rare earth metals are used in a lot of military applications and commercial applications, and we don't have enough because we've allowed that to atrophy in this country. So again, it's a boiling frog scenario across the industrial base. We allowed ourselves to be hoodwinked into thinking that the world is flat, we can all depend on one another. You don't have to build a capacity for rare earth metals in this country. You can buy it from somebody else until that somebody else turns into an enemy. That drives costs up, which makes an $817.5 billion budget look pretty big and fat, but it doesn't go far when you're talking about platforms like one submarine that costs, $16 billion or whatever the B-21 costs. So we're going to pay to put American airmen and American sailors on the best ships and aircraft possible, but we're going to have to pay for that. So I was at a dinner in Washington recently with the former Secretary of the Navy, and we were talking about the budget approaching, the defense budget approaching $1 trillion. And I think it was Congressman Rogers from Ohio, sir. Is he the head of the House Appropriations Committee? Armed Services. One of his staffers was there, and he told Speaker McCarthy, look, I can fix this with the 2 Ps. Procurement, which is what I just talked about, and personnel. And I think the belief is that if you allow personnel to attrit and retire, Naval Sea Systems Command is 80,000 people. A lot of them are very, very senior people and are going to retire. It's like Heather said about AWACS. When all those battle managers go away, just let them go. You lose a lot of experience. We can't replace that with artificial intelligence, and we can't replace that with machines. It's got to be the human brain. So we've got to think about this, and we've got to think carefully through this crisis that we're in today to try to make the best use of that budget. Thank you.
Great. So I've got a great question here by email for Admiral Fogo. It says, what's the off-ramp in Ukraine for Putin and Zelensky? It seems to be a perpetual cycle of escalation. Germany started off providing helmets, and now we're giving them tanks. So how does this end without Putin going nuclear.
Yeah, that's a serious threat. And I've talked to a lot of people about the tactical use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Will Putin do it? I believe he will absolutely do it if backed into a corner. No Russian premier in the history of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, has survived a loss of face, a loss of a campaign. So if he loses this campaign, he's done. He's going to end up in a shallow grave someplace because you know, it's like a soap opera with all of these oligarchs and people like Prigozhin that runs the paramilitary Wagner group, these guys that throw drug addicts and convicts at the problem in Ukraine. So there's only one answer, and that is Russia has to be defeated. And if we defeat Russia in this campaign, if Russia loses in Ukraine and pulls back and goes away, then Putin will be gone. The concern is who comes after him. Is it worse or is it better? I don't know. But we should not take our foot off the accelerator. It took a while. We got the tanks. We got the Leopards from the Germans, the Poles, and the others that have the German tank, and the Germans have given permission, and the M1s are going in. While we're giving them new M1s off the production line, it's going to take a year instead of all the old M1s that are laying around in boneyards. I don't know. You'd have to ask an Army guy or procurement or DOD about that. But I think we could do this a lot faster. The next step will be air defenses, integrated air and missile defense, to keep these drones and missiles from coming in and killing civilians in apartment complexes around the country, and F-16s. That's what they want, and I think we should give it to them. And I think this is going to go badly for Putin, but it's not going to happen quickly, and that means it's going to be ugly for Ukraine for the foreseeable future, and at least the next year. But God bless President Zelensky and the stamina and the staying power of the Ukrainian people. It's absolutely impressive.
Another email question. So the Russian Air Force has been largely, and this is for Heather, by the way, the Russian Air Force has been largely ineffective in Ukraine. Any lessons we should take from that? Are we mirror imaging the way that we would do that, looking at the Russian lack of coherent air campaign?
So we absolutely are mirror imaging how we would employ air power and how Russia employs air power. Russia views their air power as basically airborne artillery. And so really the way they use their aircraft is very, very different. They were not coordinated in their initial application of air power. What people don't realize is that what Russia has done is they have pulled back, they've learned their lessons, and they have changed their approach. Now they're still not doing strategic interdiction or suppression of enemy air defenses the way that the US or other Western nations would do. But people don't realize that Russia is actually still being fairly effective in their employment of fighters, and they're getting further and further away from the front lines. So yes, on one hand, when we look at them, we go, wow, they're not employing the way that we would expect. Only if you don't understand what Russian doctrine is. Furthermore, there's a lot of challenges with their logistics. There's a lot of challenges with their sustainment. But again, they are learning and they are improving, and we have seen that happen over the course of the fall. That's another reason why it's absolutely critical that we provide the Ukrainians with integrated air and missile defense. So air defense systems, missile defense systems, counter-drone systems, and importantly, fighters. I mean, I am horrified by how we are seeing echoes of World War I trench warfare set up in Ukraine, because it is just a proof to me that if you don't have air power, you are doomed to a slogging war of attrition and atrocity. If we don't get the Ukraine's air defenses, counter drones, and actual air power that can make a difference, and I appreciate the drones that they do have, the smaller drones they do have, they do need to have larger remotely piloted aircraft that have a greater capacity, greater payload, but we now understand, watching the air campaign flow out there, that there's a very, very limited time span on any of those remotely piloted aircraft. They matter, but they're a limited time span. But we need to get them the capabilities that will allow them to employ air power independently in order to be able to transform this from a 2D attrition warfare to a three-dimensional warfare. There's a reason why the airmen that came out of World War I said over, not through.
Okay, any questions? Yes, sir. Bob, you got a question?
I'm asking everyone to use the mic.
Because I've got plenty up here. I can keep going.
You got it, okay. Over there. Anybody over here next? Over here, okay, you're next. Go, sir. Okay. You're next, sir.
Reference the F-16s. I'm strongly in favor of our support of Ukraine, so I'll caveat this. But the F-16s, how long, based on what you said, will it take for the Ukrainian pilots to get up to speed to be able to fly those planes and use them effectively?
You need to understand that fourth-generation aircraft, and specifically the F-16 as well, were designed to minimize the demand, the flying demand, so that you could actually focus on the weapon system and how you employ the aircraft. Ukraine is an existential situation. They don't need 12 months of training like I did when I first went through my B course. They need to be able to get combat power to the front today. So they could use something more like a senior leader course, because we would be starting off with experienced fighter pilots, just simply transitioning them to a different weapon system. And they also don't need to necessarily have the same level of intricate knowledge and mastery. I mean, I had to be able to draw out and essentially rebuild all of my systems from a knowledge standpoint when I went through my courses. They don't need that. They just need to have the information necessary to be able to employ the weapon effectively. And I believe that they can do that in 2 months or less.
We have a question over there. Patrick?
Go ahead.
Question over here.
Thank you both.
Patrick, stand up.
Thank you both. I would like to emphasize China. In 1998, I had the opportunity to negotiate with the Chinese government on some issues on behalf of a client. And during the course of that, I had the opportunity to get to know the Chinese bureaucrats there and their attitudes towards the West, and what their view of the future was. And what I just want to pass along was, even in 1998, before so many things have happened and so before so much change has taken place there in their country, that the overwhelming impression that I had from those Chinese leaders was a sense of manifest destiny of ruling the entire Asia-Pacific region. That's all I wanted to pass along. It was an undeniable attitude that they passed along, and I just wanted to emphasize that. Thank you.
We have a question over here.
So just a quick question. So the need is real. You guys both made a great case for that. What does the prognosis look like for Capitol Hill in the next 2 to 4 years to actually fund, even directionally, this sort of need and gap?
I was talking to the congressman about this, and Congress has done a good job in allocation of resources. Defense budget went up $37.5 billion thanks to the Luria Golden Amendment, which put us over 800. She's no longer with us because she didn't make it back after the last election. But Congress is trying to help. We have disagreement inside the services and also inside the Department of Defense and inside the defense committees on the Hill about what's the right way to go. The reason that we have disagreement is because we have no grand strategy in this country. So we decided a long time ago, after the failed mission to get the Iranian hostages back, that we were going to go with reform in the joint force by way of Goldwater-Nichols and make the combatant commanders report to the Secretary of Defense, and the service chiefs, the CNO, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, are the ones that man, train, and equip. But we can't come up with a common denominator, a common answer of what systems do we need. We have a congressional commission looming on the horizon to come in and try to help the Navy determine what those systems are. I've had discussions on the Hill. I had discussion with Congressman Luria about this. She was somewhat chagrined that I'd written an article saying we don't need another layer of bureaucracy, and asked me why did I say that. Because I was on a congressional commission in 1994, along with Heather's boss, Dave Deptula, the Commission on Roles and Missions of the Armed Forces. The first question that commission asked of 19 commissioners and the chairman, a guy named John White, who later became the Deputy Secretary of Defense, is, why do the services have 5 air forces? Coast Guard, Marine Corps, Navy, Army. Army has helicopters and fixed wing, and the Air Force. Why do we have 5 air forces? That was 1994. And here we are in 2023, and we have 5 air forces.
Oh, no, by the way,
Is there a way
we've
to
got-
do it better? You know, can we combine and get some synergy?
And I'll just add a little bit on that. We've got 16 space forces. So, yeah, across the entire DoD. So I fully agree. But I would say, 2 things that are absolutely crucial that we avoid as we go into this congressional budget cycle and future years is we must avoid continuing resolutions and we must avoid sequestration. We have never, as a department, whole department, recovered from the pain and the injury inflicted by sequestration in 2011. And also, when it comes to continuing resolutions, everyone thinks, well, that's just fine, but it prohibits any of the services from new starts, so buying new things, or starting new programs of record, or starting new research and development issues. And at a point where both the Navy and the Air Force have got to move forward in that R&D, have got to progress those R&D into programs of record and actual things that we can buy and field, continuing resolutions prevent us from doing that. So I can't predict the future, although I will say if you want to go back to my example of fighter pilots and fighter jets, and it takes 5 years to build either one of them, that's your strategic surprise time horizon. It takes us 5 years, and that's with a hot production line, right? I'm not even talking about inventing new things. That's a hot production line. That's assuming you've got the pilot training bases to train all those pilots. From the time that you start to the time that you have an experienced, incredible combat round. If we knew we were going to war with China 3 years from now, we would already be 2 years too late. There would be nothing that we could do about that. And I'm not even addressing the industrial base issues that Admiral Fogo spoke about, because those are very real issues that not only affect our shipyards, but also affect our aerospace industrial base as well. So very serious considerations for both of these departments, because what we build, you can't draft and field in 3 months. These 2 services are really predicated on that advanced technology and that experienced, savvy warfighter. So the sequestration and continuing resolutions disproportionately harm the Air Force and the Navy.
Yeah, I got to add one more thing too, and that is the lack of trust between industry and the services or DoD. So, the heat over programs that are truncated, the Seawolf program or the B-2 program or the Ford, which got the USS Ford, the carrier with the EMALS that got all the headlines. That goes back on industry, and it creates mistrust between industry and the Pentagon. We've got to bridge that gap. We're all Americans in this fight. So Pentagon thinks that industry takes too much on the margins, too much profit. They don't put enough back into it. The industry thinks the Pentagon, with their continuing resolutions and their constantly changing of plans and their alterations to ships or aircraft as you're going through the production line sets them back. Then we demand that it be delivered on the day that we said when we signed the contract, but we've made 100 or 1,000 changes to it, so it's almost impossible. You put them in a very difficult spot. Heather talked about the Valley of Death. So again, if we had a grand strategy that actually had a pillar, which was industry and our shipbuilding and industrial base, and bringing them in and consulting them and telling them, here's the capability, the capacity that we need to beat China in a war. What can you do for us? Instead of holding our cards tight and then saying, we're going to compete this ship or this type model series of aircraft, and they put a lot of investment into it, and then we pick the other guy, and then a year or 2 later, we cancel that program. It drives them absolutely insane. It would drive me insane, too. It's not the way to do business.
Okay, we're going to take a couple more questions. Maureen, did you have one?
Well, I've been very proud that the way the U.S. and the way our European allies have bonded together to support the Ukraine. But lately, I'm hearing a bunch of talk about not supporting them. And the other night, I was watching Tucker Carlson, and they had one of the speakers there was talking about the graft that goes on in the Ukraine, and I know we're all aware of that, but Zelensky's trying to do something about it. We were hearing all these negative speakers about supporting the Ukraine. That really worries me. How serious is this tide? Some of them in my own party are not in favor of supporting the Ukraine. Do you see that as a serious issue, or is that a sidebar? I'm worried about it.
Yeah, I think the folks, countries like Ukraine that were under the Soviet umbrella for such a long period of time and have not come into the Euro-Atlantic institutions like NATO or the European Union suffer from corruption. It's no surprise. You've read about that now for 4 or 5 years. So there are problems there. Yes, I think Zelensky's trying to do something about it. But if somebody wants to threaten cutting off aid to Ukraine because of a problem which I don't think is major, I think it's minor in the big scheme of things with corruption, then what's the end state? Ukraine loses and is occupied by the Russians. What's next? Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, then that's NATO. If you attack NATO, all NATO allies, including us, are required to respond through Article 5. Now, we'll have another big debate about that in this country, too. But if Russia starts moving on the rest of Europe, we're going to go to World War III. And so I'd much rather have this campaign and Russia stopped in Ukraine than have it spill over into NATO. So I, like you, ma'am, wish that people would stop that rhetoric. Heather?
I absolutely echo and reinforce everything that you just said. I mean, people may be concerned about the cost of the military aid packages that we're sending over to Ukraine, but the cost of not doing that is so much more in terms of blood, treasure, and security for the United States. So this is essentially a proxy war on the cheap, and plus it's just the right thing to do from a global strategic standpoint. And furthermore, it's weakening Russia as the longer that this goes on. So there are a number of reasons for us to continue to support military aid to Ukraine, and frankly, as far as I'm concerned, we should accelerate our support for Ukraine, because the sooner that we can end the conflict on favorable terms, which means Ukraine wins, then the sooner we can rehabilitate Ukraine and absorb them into the broader Western European norms and standards, so addressing a lot of those the corruption issues, which you're right, they existed, they still exist. That's why you've seen Zelensky turn over a number of his senior personnel for those very reasons. But there is goodness for us in aiding Ukraine to win, not slow leaking them support to just lose, because there's a limited amount of people in Ukraine that they can feed the fight with. And so if we let them lose by attrition, which is again why I'm very concerned that this is a two-dimensional land war of attrition and atrocity, and we're not allowing them the advantages that air power and air defense can provide, that if we don't equip them to win, the only choice is that they are going to lose because they will run out of people.
Scott, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. First of all, outstanding tonight. Both of you were just above and beyond. Yeah, no question. These are 2 quick answers, but I have 2 quick questions. First of all, you've shared all kinds of information with all of us here tonight. We're all going to get out of here, and we're all going to go off to our whatever we do tomorrow and all different occupations and whatever. When you go home tonight, and you put your head in the pillow, what is the one thing that is always going to be something that you're concerned about in our nation's security, in our defense, and just everything that we've shared with us tonight? 30 seconds, what's the one thing that you're concerned about most?
Making sure that the young men and women who go to war do so equipped to win, to go into bad guy land, do their job, and come home safely.
Admiral, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, sorry, I can't do it in 30 seconds. And since I'm an admiral, I'm going to take as long as I want. A difficult interview, Scott. Anyways, no, I'll tell you, I don't like the rhetoric that goes on across America of, we're not ready to fight. 23% of our youth are qualified to be members of the military service because of, drugs, some kind of legal problem with the law, tattoos, or physical, inability to compete. And I was at an event with the Navy League down in Pensacola, Florida, a few months back, and the Command Master Chief of CENTCOM, Central Command, was a Navy Explosive Ordnance Disposal Master Chief. His name was Jamie Hurdle, just like me, Jamie. So he got up and he goes, when I joined the Navy back in like 1982 or 83, I'm a Naval Academy graduate from 81, so we're the same kind of era. I went through boot camp and I went through my EOD training. All the guys teaching us were Vietnam War era. And when they came in, rough and tough and rough and tumble, and having gone through not only the experience of the war in Vietnam, but the very negative and unfortunate reaction that they got from Americans when they came back from that war, they told us, the boots, you guys are the worst example of American sailors we have ever seen. You will not be able to take our place. You guys are absolutely terrible. You're going to fail. You believe in all this stupid stuff. You don't believe in American people. And here we are, 30s plus 34 years later, and he's on his way out as the Command Master Chief. I heard the same thing. And you know what? The youth of today are just as capable as my era and the era before us were, and that is exemplified by these Sea Cadets and Young Marine ROTC and Junior Navy ROTC. So don't let anybody convince you that Americans are not going to fight, no matter what age they are. So generationally, young people, you are our reliefs. We will back you up and go out there and do great things for our country, and thank you very much.
It's getting late, so I'll just get to the second question. Whenever you leave someplace like this, and we've had all the information that you've shared with us, what's going on, potential solutions, everything about it, what do we do? What's the take-home? When we walk out that door, and I go home and tell my wife or tell my kids, or, hey, you have no idea where I was tonight. What'd you learn? What are we supposed to do? We're citizens of this incredible country we all call home. So what's the thing you want us to leave here with tonight to do that we can help everything that you're concerned about?
I would say our service never ends. And service isn't limited to being a first responder or wearing a uniform. And even when we hang up that uniform and move beyond, our obligation to our nation has not stopped. And part of what you're doing here today is exactly what I would ask in terms of educating yourself beyond whatever cable TV news bite, 30-second rant that you might listen to, but to actually get smart about the issues. And that's why I believe that what I do at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, what Admiral Fogo is doing with standing up his think tank at the Navy League is absolutely crucial, because that's where you get the real information. We are not partisan. We are simply focused on the national security issues and analyzing with data, with operational credibility, that experience, looking at the industrial base, providing holistic solutions on issues that are going to be relevant not just today, but looking forward into the future. So please visit our websites, support us financially, and stay in touch with your representatives, both on the congressional and, in the House and on the Senate side, because they ultimately will be those who hold the DoD responsible, accountable, and resource the DoD appropriately. So move beyond cable TV, get beyond that angertainment, and look at the real analysis from the think tanks.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I would say don't forget what you heard here tonight. And as a citizen of this great country, don't forget that it is your constitutional responsibility to vote. So vote for our representatives. The fact that you have Congressman Self here tonight spending time with his wife and himself amongst this great crowd to listen to you, to listen to us, is very commendable. And if you don't have an opportunity to connect with the congressman or your representatives in whatever districts you live in. You can do it vicariously through us, through Heather and me, and we need your support, both in terms of resources and financial support and moral support for the Center for Maritime Strategy and the Billy Mitchell Institute. And young lady, I think you're the next question.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, ma'am, you had mentioned a little bit ago about the youth and what you would like for younger people stepping up. So, what does aviation look like for, in the future for women?
So aviation for the future for women is totally open. The Air Force is making every effort to make sure that cockpits, as we go forward, can accommodate any kind of physiology. So when I went into pilot training, I had to stand up really tall and hold my breath and kind of stand on my tippy toes to make sure I hit 5'4", and I had a seat height of 35 inches because that's what the ejection seat minimums were. As we move forward into new aircraft, we are ensuring that we have enough adaptability of the seat, of the rudder pedals, of the ejection seat to expand the envelope for the ejection seats to allow people of all sizes. And this isn't just a woman thing. I mean, think about some of our allies and partners who as a nation may have different statures than we do. So really, that's not going to be closed to women. Everything is going to be open to us within the aviation department, and I highly encourage you to do that, because raising my right hand and swearing an oath of service to my nation and doing that in combat aviation was the greatest thing I ever did with my life. And I wish I was back in your shoes.
All right, so Scott, you stole my last question, but you did it perfectly, so I'm going to leave that and make it the last question. I appreciate it. I just want to say personally, this is the 8th one of these we've done, and I think it's by far the most informative and substantive discussion we've had, and frankly, it's exactly the reason we put this together, to bring experts like this so you can interact with them and ask the questions that are on your mind. So, Admiral Fogo, Heather, we certainly appreciate you being here. If you'll remain on the stage just a minute. Scott, you want to come up? Let's give him one more hand.
I had a question before we break. I have a question. I am speaking as a mother of a military officer and his friends who are on the ground now. And maybe you do not know, but in the past year or so, they have been imposed on by the Pentagon with advisors at every step, in every meeting, and everything that they do on diversity and inclusion, and saying the right words at the right time. And I hear them talking all the time to me and their friends. Who can stand up and get this stopped? Because if they can't mention it, they don't want to lose their jobs like the other COVID men and women have. I'm shaking because I'm speaking for them when I hear them. I do not think the Pentagon has anywhere near your sense of urgency on what is really going on in the world, because what the heck can we as parents, relatives, veterans do to get this stopped and focus back on the war fighter and not saying the right words today? Every meeting, they have somebody inserted in. Everything that they are doing, it has to stop, and we've got to do something. And if you have anything you can do, any of you, please step up. Thank you.
I actually think this is an important thing to respond to, because we cannot instill distrust among warfighters by having that kind of oversight. We have to expand our talent pool to bring in the best and the brightest of people who want to serve and want to be there. And honestly, I don't care what color, creed, sex, gender, politics, animal, whatever. I don't care. If we share the same mission purpose, and I know you got my back, I know that you are focused on putting bombs on target on time and checking my 6, that's what I care about. And we need to reinstill a mission-purposed culture where the things that we believe, the norms that we share, our culture and our creed is focused on our jobs, on our national security. And trust among a unit, a squad, a fighter squadron, whatever, trust results from performance, and trust results from mission execution and repetition. And when we develop that mission-purposed culture, because group culture matters. Group culture matters. That's how we belong. That's part of how we become who we are. That's part of how we are stamped into combat-ready warriors. And that's a good thing. That's an important thing. And we cannot destroy that through inserting unnecessary oversight. Because you know what? If you need to have a little bit of oversight, what's that called? Leadership. And the other thing that's important about high-performing combat teams is respect. When we all adhere, we share that mission, we adhere to those norms, codes, cultures, etc. You don't care about the other stuff. That doesn't matter, but I respect your commitment, your service, your work ethic, your commitment to excellence, your drive, and that we have that bond that we will go above and beyond for each other. And none of that other stuff matters. But we have to empower leadership and focus on mission.
No, I would agree with Heather in that this kind of stuff, ma'am, that you're talking about goes in phases. As I look at the young Marines back there and their leader, the warrant, who probably has seen combat and been deployed overseas, the only thing you care about if you're a Marine, and I'm not a Marine, but they'll tell me, is when you're in the foxhole, doesn't matter what the gender politics or the politics or beliefs of that individual is next to you is that person a member of the band and brothers and sisters that's going to defend you when somebody comes across the parapet and tries to kill you? You know, are they there for you? On a submarine, now I know this one. A submarine has 140 men and women. We brought women in 8 years ago. It's been very successful. And on a submarine, the weakest link in the chain can sink the ship. We have something called rig for dive. Enlisted guy goes around, shuts all the valves, and officer checks it. If somebody screws that up and you dive the boat and water comes into the people tank, is what we like to say, then you will flood the ship. And most of the time you'll stop it. But if you don't, you'll have an incident like we had with Scorpion and Thresher. You may go down and never come back up again. Running the reactor plant depends on the level of knowledge that the enlisted men, the chiefs, and the officers have. We have a zero-tolerance policy for any mistakes when operating marine nuclear propulsion systems at sea, and we have a perfect track record of 70 years of operation. Why? Because when you take these young men and women and put them in the pressure cooker, or as Heather said, give them the mission, they will perform. And it doesn't matter where they come from, what their family background is, how rich or how poor their mom and dad is. The best thing about the United States Navy and the United States military writ large is you can bootstrap yourself up, you know, coming out of the middle of Kansas and go onto a Navy ship and be very successful, because we'll give you every opportunity to succeed. And so carrying out the mission and working together as a band of brothers and sisters, I think that it'll overcome or overshadow any policy changes that come from administration to administration to administration. So don't worry about it.
Well, I'll tell you what, all I can say is to the two of you, and I'm sure everybody in here would agree, talk about insightful discussion. I mean, you are above and beyond, and I've been at every one of these, and I don't want to compare those that have been here already and those that are coming up, but you both get an A+. It was outstanding. Would you not agree? Yeah, outstanding. And because of that, Admiral and Ms. Penny, we have some parting gifts. How about this? You think it was, I don't know, who gives parting gifts? I don't know. But at any rate, we've got a couple of small gifts. If you'd like to come forward here and accept our gifts. First of all, knowing that you have enough plaques and pictures to fill a museum, I'm sure both of you do, we've made a donation in your name to the organizations you've designated. And for Admiral Fogo, that's the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society. And for Ms. Penny, That's the Hanoi Hilton exhibit at the American Heritage Museum. That's in Stowe, Maine, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, Scott, if I could say this, is really kind of talk about the Hanoi Hilton exhibit at the American Heritage Museum. They have acquired real cells, real bricks, real concrete from the Hanoi Hilton, where our POWs were tortured when they were taken captive. They're putting that exhibit together in time to be able to commemorate the homecoming, the first homecoming of the POWs on February 11th. Please visit their website, because this is, outside of Vietnam, the only opportunity that any airman, Air Force, Navy, or Marine would have to be able to touch this hallowed ground, because we can't go back to battlefields, we can't visit ships. This truly is, when you honor the POWs and MIAs, this is where they went. And this is the actual concrete, the actual bricks. So thank you so much for your donation.
That's great. That's great. And let me make you aware of the fact, in addition, as I mentioned earlier, half of the proceeds from the 50/50 raffle will also be added to that donation. So you're both going to be millionaires by the morning. That's, it's great stuff. All right. Second, we have this limited edition shirt embroidered with the NDBS logo. And if it isn't the right size, certainly we'll make sure that we get the size. Where's the shirt? Oh. Here, I'm going to hold that. Want to show it?
Yeah.
Have you seen these? We have them out in the lobby for those of you that would like to leave tonight. They're $1,000 a piece. And all the money goes to the National Defense Briefing Series, all right? I'm doing what I can, trying to help the cause, guys. All right, very good. Second.
Right size, we'll make them the right size.
Okay. All right, and if you listen carefully, all the applause you're about to hear is for you and for you. Outstanding. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, just wait up on the stage, though, because we've got a couple of other things to take care of. First of all, where's Heather?
Patty?
I mean Patty, yeah, there she is. Come on up here. Oh, I'm sorry. I've got too many Heathers up here on the stage. Okay. We'll have, let's see. Before we conclude, this is the ROTC CAP cadets to come forward. Also, stand right there if you would. Can we get all the cadets to come forward?